There are innumerable decisions that go into making games, from resource allocation and artistic direction to narrative themes and game balance. An exhaustive analysis of these for a single title is far beyond the scope of a standard review, and completely outside the reasonable attention span of even the most hardcore gaming enthusiast. Instead, this series is an attempt to identify and examine some of the more subtle decisions that go into making a game, how they elicit the response they do, and how they fit its structure and facilitate its aims. In short, these videos are about the tangible details, large or small, that enrich core themes or gameplay ideas, and how they're implemented. And because I considered the title Appropriate Design Choices to be exceptionally dull, welcome to episode 1 of Elegant Game Design. So without further ado, let's begin. The game with the honour of kicking off our inaugural episode is Firewatch, a somewhat somber contemplation of companionship and escapism. A quick glance at my hastily scribbled impressions that never materialized into a full review was enough to remind me of the game's ups and downs. The mysteries that were never fully realized on one hand, and on the other, the elements that were still compelling. When it came time for the merry tradition of Game of the Year to rear its ugly head again, I stumbled across a feature on Game Informer that had contributions from numerous designers. On a list by Ian Dallas from Giant Sparrow, he of Unfinished Swan and Edith Finch fame, was Firewatch, which he summed up succinctly as a game with lots of really smart, elegant design choices, mentioning in particular how the character swiped his hand past items to pick them up, which was a neat and labour-saving solution for a smaller team. Somewhat unsurprisingly, his summation is spot on, and today I want to focus on something from Firewatch that's just a touch larger, what I roughly deem to be the Firewatch introduction. When beginning the game, the prefatory sequence that greets players is equally simple and nuanced. Most importantly, it grants necessary context quickly and compactly, but as it does so, it presents a fascinating back and forth between player perspective, snippets of our character's ascent to his new job, and text-based exposition, a thorough basis of the protagonist's history in a specific, non-visual manner. But more importantly, the back and forth cadence captures something quite subtle, a particular process of a mind in contemplation. This vacillation forms a sort of flexible, elastic, bi-chronological story, Henry's history twisted with his contemporaneous actions, where moving between the two periods in question is completely natural. The way this is crafted depicts a surprisingly accurate account of a real-life sensation derived from what is called autonoetic consciousness, one of the branches of mental recollection involved with remembering events and occasions. When researching this phenomenon, I noticed particularly how it was defined according to a sense of dissociation from your immediate surroundings when remembering either past events or placing oneself in future situations. Accordingly, players' perspective of the in-game world is totally extinguished during these recollection segments, nudging players to fall into this dissociative sensation for themselves, surrounded by a comfortable cocoon of audio direction, and faced with text to activate the player's imagination. At this point, it's important to note that this sensation is not confined purely to memory, but can extend to imagination, and should be thought of more correctly as putting oneself mentally in either past or future circumstances. Perhaps the best means of describing the phenomenon is through rhetoric. Have you ever experienced a situation during a long walk, run, or hike, when your mind begins to wander and you switch onto autopilot? When you're brought back to your senses by some external stimulus, you realize just how far away from reality your mind had taken you. Indeed, it's no coincidence that there are two examples of just such a thing happening during this introduction. Once with a sudden shudder as Henry hits the ground having leaped down a rock face, and another when he stumbles across something particularly memorable, in this case a deer. Interestingly, the game also adds a temporal element to the proceedings. This notion of a mind losing track during its journey is also therefore reinforced by the passage of time. As Henry finishes his ascent and arrives at his new post, we are granted our first glimpse of darkness, adding another stitch to both the character and by extension the player's dissociation from time and place, as night is suddenly hoisted upon us, mimicking the character's sudden realization of how dark it had actually become. First-person games will always force the player to mesh to a higher degree with the avatar sensorially, and this sequence demonstrates how playing with certain senses can stimulate players emotionally. From a storytelling perspective, as primarily experiential devices, games often rely on a fluctuating relationship of shared experience between player and character. First and foremost, this process, by reminding the player of a common experience, contributes a lot of substance to the richness and realness of the character, so that any further character-derived motivation that the player is hitherto unaware of seems all the more legitimate. In other words, it fleshes out the character in an extremely realistic way. Second, and unique to the gaming medium, it draws the player closer to the character by allowing them to experience a shadow of the actual sensation for themselves. In this case, by facilitating the dissociative sensation when recalling Henry's history by restricting and subsequently opening the player's perspective when appropriate. And, of course, stimulating imagination with written description. To put it in a way more palatable to Atticus Finch, it allows us to walk a step further in his shoes than could otherwise be achieved. The entire sequence is quite a powerful foundation for the tale and its subsequent revelations, such that any of our protagonist's reflections and growth can draw on the player's more direct sense of empathy. Next up is another small quirk from Firewatch, but as something a little less grand than our first item. It involves the particular means of interacting with Firewatch's story and, by extension, the relationship presented that is the pivotal point of character development for the entire tale. On console, dialogue choice in Firewatch is a precise process of input that can be broken down into 3 steps. First, holding down the trigger. Second, navigating to your choice of dialogue. And third, to confirm, releasing the same trigger. There's a crucial juncture at the 3rd step. Many games could simply have the player confirm their choice with the standard confirmation button. But instead, Firewatch chooses a method that's interestingly redolent of how a walkie-talkie functions in reality, holding down the button, speaking, and releasing the same button when you've finished. Though it may seem similar to what makes some of the more effective QuickTime events successful, it's not quite the same. Take this portion of Heavy Rain for example, where the player enacts a small correlation to what's happening on screen. In this case, contorting their fingers as Ethan Mars squeezes past obstacles. In Firewatch, however, rather than providing a microcosmic sense of what the protagonist is physically experiencing, Firewatch contains what is in fact a whole-bodied analog. It could be argued that the step-by-step process is not exactly a complete translation because the dialogue is technically expressed in-game after the input process has finished. However, from an internal perspective in which the player holds down the trigger to consider what he will say, decides on it, and then releases the trigger to confirm, the actual expression of the chosen dialogue by the player avatar, I would argue, is secondary, as the actual contemplation of what is to be said is enough of a substitute. Especially when considered in light of the fact that thought and speech are rarely separated in basic situations where speech is essentially a stream of consciousness. Admittedly, there is no major advantage to this particular quirk. It has no substantial nor consequential effect on the game as a whole, yet nonetheless manages to lend a sense of authenticity to dialogue. It is, at the very least, a wonderful novelty, and one of the most memorable features of Firewatch as a whole. Our final item for today comes from Uncharted 4. For all the time I spent in its stellar multiplayer mode, and how much I champion that aspect of it, everyone will always naturally be more drawn to Naughty Dog's single-player efforts. I made it fairly clear in my review what I thought of the game and its shortcomings. However, it's hard to deny the fact that this is one of the few gaming franchises that has grown immensely with time, and along with time, our fondness for its cast of personalities. Now, it could be argued that Uncharted 4 perhaps strays too far towards sentimentality with this iteration, to an extent that is a little foreign to the original Uncharted DNA, but that's a debate for another time. Nonetheless, today I still wish to examine how they achieve such an effect for Uncharted 4, focusing on one particular sequence. Number 3 on our list, therefore, is something I drew attention to in my review, and it's giving the player our first glimpse of an aged Nathan Drake in a wetsuit. What I found remarkable about this highly unremarkable detail is how it cements a core theme in a very concrete way. First and foremost, the immediate impression it grants of Drake in an outfit that's so revealing presents the strongest evidence of Drake's age. This is not primarily his visage, his face, or his wrinkles, especially considering the player has no reliable frame of reference for this. Far more noticeable is his physique, thanks in part to a direct point of comparison with the earlier Drake's fortune, with which longtime players can now quite easily contrast him. What this short, controllable sequence stresses is his fuller frame, wider midriff, and broader chest. What we see in Uncharted 4 is the frame of a man no longer quite in the height of his youth. By spotlighting his build and physique instead of specific facial details, the game puts to the fore what someone in reality notices when they're reintroduced to a person they haven't seen in a while. An old friend that's coming back into your life, and in particular a male one, a teacher or mentor, an uncle, or even a parent. This reaction is in many ways our foremost as humans, who tend to form impressions quickly from broad, sweeping details like anatomy and constitution rather than focusing on specifics. From here, the game attempts to leverage this very real feeling of the return of an old friend against the player, who has functioned ostensibly as the main window to all of Drake's previous adventures, to such an extent that player and adventure are in many ways inseparable. The player should in fact be considered a silent, inconsequential companion. Therefore, by placing these specifically physical details at the forefront with a pertinent comparison in hand, and with them evoking the concept of a returning figure, the game manages to frame Drake's hiatus in such a way that he has been away from us, the player, rather than the other way around, and, as mentioned, by extension, absent from his previous life of adventure. To examine it in a vacuum, if this sequence goes even a small way to reinforcing the idea that instead of the player missing more of Drake's adventures, in fact, he had left them behind, it should be considered significant. To put it simply, if this sequence was presented to players completely devoid of context, this specific physical detail may just be strong enough to impart to players the feeling that this iteration of Drake is returning to a life of thievery, rather than it simply suggesting that this is just an older version of a still practicing fortune hunter. Indeed, the sensation this captured for me is extremely interesting and quite rare. Even from a technological perspective, to have thought and effort put into the physical development of a character is notable. It's a far cry from a new haircut and outfit, your standard anime-style depiction that time has elapsed and characters have grown. That, admittedly, still has place in certain romanticized scenarios. At the very least, this minor playable segment gave longtime fans a small nod to an earlier entry that seldom receives much love nowadays. These three examples demonstrate how games can employ real-life concepts and sensations to better harness narrative ideas, whether through sensory cues and style of exposition, basic input, or character design and depiction respectively. Remember, these are just small details that I've noticed while playing, which I wanted to explore and summate in a way that made me tie them together as neatly as I could. Hopefully, it's something that people find interesting.